Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another live stream. My name is Matt Bailey, live with SMWS. I'm your national ambassador for the Scotch Malt Whisky Society here in Australia. I really appreciate you tuning in when we do these live streams, which used to be every single night, but instead we're going for quality over quantity this year, and we're doing some very special live streams each week, so still quite a bit. But we're going to keep it more about some special guests, having some great people join us, have a chat with certain people. And tonight is no different. We're having a chat live right now with Luke McCarthy, one of Australia's most respected spirits authors, whiskey reviewers, journalists, and as he says, occasional bartender. And we're going to have a chat about some of that journey with him, about what it means, what Australian Spirit is doing at the moment, what it means to be a spirits journalist, and everything like that. I want to throw up some comments from Mark Teague, from James Finnegan. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I'm going to bring Luke in right now, so please make him feel very welcome. Luke, welcome to the stream.
Hey. Thanks for having me, mate. Appreciate it.
In Melbourne. You're based in Melbourne, that's correct?
That's correct. Yep.
We've got this Melbourne to Sydney internet connection working, which is exciting. So that's great.
Good to hear, mate. Good to hear.
Yeah. Really appreciate you taking some time out on your Tuesday night to have a chat with us live on SMWS about your role, about everything that you do, really, and just give a bit more sort of context and understanding to what it is. And I just want to quickly throw up that comment. Miranda Marie says, "Hi, Luke." Big.
Hey. Wow, there's so many people here in Melbourne that I haven't even had much of a chance to see recently with everything that's been going on. So a big hello to Miranda.
Yes, awesome. As I know her as Marvelous Miranda, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm going to start off by asking, just to give some context to what you do and where did it all begin? So you're a spirits writer, journalist, reviewer. I think that's a very fair assessment. And where did it all begin for you? What's the catalyst? Where did sort of this whole journey begin for you? Was there a sort of a light bulb moment in spirits for you when you went, I'm going to follow this. I'm going to pursue this?
I don't think it was definitely a series of moments, as it sort of happens, I think, with a lot of writers generally. But the first time I'd been drinking whiskey from a young age, basically, and I'd done some bar work after I sort of finished uni, and then did some travel. And it was really when I was traveling that I first got heavily involved in Scottish whiskey and very interested in it. I was lucky to know some people who were working in the Scottish brewing industry at the time, and I was just over there having fun, really. And it just turned out that we went visiting distilleries, breweries throughout Scotland. So I got to drink a lot of single malts at the source with the people who made them. And that was probably 10 years ago now, maybe a bit longer. And all of that was just really just natural. I look back on it now and it's, you sort of plan out those sort of trips, but, we just popped into all these distilleries and went to pubs and just drank locally. And I've pretty much, always been a fan of drinking locally wherever I travel to. Came back after I'd finished some uni stuff there, kept writing. My background is actually more in literature history. That's what I studied. I studied writing too. And then I started working in a bar called Chez Regine in Melbourne. That was in 2012. And so for people who don't know, Chez was sort of the forerunner to what Whiskey and Almond is today. And that was a really quick, amazing tutorial into hospitality, whiskey, you name it. It was an incredible place. It was incredible to be in Melbourne at that time bartending. And then, a year and a half, 2 years after that, Whiskey and Almond opened and everything with whiskey became really serious. And I had to make some decisions then about whether or not I wanted to continue working with whiskey and diving so deep into it as we did back in those days, as Whiskey and Almond still does, or whether or not I'd go elsewhere. And then from there, everything pretty much happened in the bar. And I can sort of talk about that a little bit more, but most of the opportunities that I received in writing and publishing came from meeting people at Whiskey and Almond. It was really bizarre, actually. So, yeah.
I had no idea actually that you were involved with Whiskey and Almond, with Chez Regine from such an early point.
Yep. And, the old 5 o'clock finishes, sometimes it felt like 6 or 7. We didn't get out of there sometimes till those days in the morning. And what would happen was, we were one of the knockoff spots for bars in the city. So, within a 6-month period, I probably met most of the top bartenders in the city at that point. And, I would be horribly nervous coming into it. We'd knock someone on at like well, sometimes it'd be 2 o'clock in the morning, sometimes 3 o'clock in the morning, because we just get hammered with hospitality and other people coming in. They come in, from sort of 3:34, and it'd just be an hour or two of power before we closed. And yeah, I tell you what, I used to get freaked out. People were asking for cocktails and whiskey chat and all that sort of stuff. I was still a pretty young bartender at that stage, and everything about Melbourne hospitality, I think, has evolved dramatically since then. But they were incredible days, and so many of I suppose, the core tenets of Whiskey and Almond were formed in those early periods then.
I still think that there's that inside joke. You had a different expression in your face if someone ordered a neat spirit or a cocktail sometimes. That was a sort of a running joke at Whiskey and Helmet for a while there.
Yes, yeah. There were so many different ways of serving, so many different jokes that were played on people. We used to do a lot of blind tasting back then as well. I feel like we did more than what a lot of bars do now, and even what Whiskey and Helmet does now. So some hilarious moments of people coming in and being given rums, given whiskey and cokes, and having them say, oh, maybe it's a Lagavulin, or maybe that's an Ardbeg, and in fact, matured in a rum cask, or blind tastings of cocktails, and just all this wacky, crazy stuff, and some big characters too in and around the scene then. So it was good fun. It was trial by fire, but it was enjoyable, that's for sure.
So, as a spirits writer, author, consultant, reviewer, I mean, we'll get to sort of the Oz Whisky review side of it in a moment, but what do you, moving forward, like this is kind of a bit of a more sort of heavier question, I guess, but what do you see as your sort of journalistic obligation to that category? What do you see as something that you've discovered through that in recent years?
Yeah, I suppose my little period within the media probably tells a slightly larger story about media generally. So what happened was, I'd been doing other writing about, I'd been reviewing books, poetry was something that I reviewed and have always been, really passionate about. So that was something that I spent a lot of time in. And so I was just sort of kicking off my writing career while everything was happening with Whiskey and Almond. And so some people got word of the fact that, I also wrote when I wasn't at the bar. And basically I think it was Simon McGoran. I've never really talked to him about this. So if he's out there, or if he ever listened to this, I think he was the guy, or someone else gave a recommendation into the editor of Fairfax and the Age and Sydney Morning Herald, who was concentrating on executive style at that point. And they basically, through looking at some of my work, said, hey, do you want to write the national drinks column for the Fairfax media, which at that stage was it was probably only really 5 or 6 writers who had that sort of reach and scope and that sort of audience. And so I ummed and ahed about it, because back then I wasn't even sort of interested in writing about booze. I sort of wanted to keep what we were doing with booze separate, what I was doing with booze separate. But I thought, no, it's such an incredible opportunity. It'd be so much fun and a really interesting role, and took it on. And that's where everything developed from there. And I suppose when it comes to journalistic integrity and thinking about journalism more generally, my purview for that column was, look, you can explore whatever you want to explore, but these are the ideals that Fairfax has and Fairfax maintains. You have to be independent from the people that you're discussing. We want independent pieces written for consumers. We don't want you to be working for brands and then telling their story. That was the idea. And amazingly, Whiskey and Almond was set up really with a similar ideal in mind. It was about, and if you look at the company that Brooke and Jules have gone off to forge, the independent whiskey company, that tells you everything you need to know. Is about, for us at that point, it was just all about educating consumers, because what it was like. The level of whiskey knowledge in Australia, and spirits knowledge generally, was so low. People had absolutely no idea what they were doing when they came into the bar. And so much of my writing just became about sort of gently trying to help them along.
I mean, I can throw back to even just some feedback coming through there. I can sort of throw back to like 3 or 4 years ago, when you'd say to people that they'd even ask, oh, do they make whiskey in Australia?
Yeah.
And that's not that long ago that question sort of was still being asked. I'd be routinely asked that at tastings or events or just elsewhere.
Yep, definitely. So I think what happened then as well was Seb Costello at Bad Frankie opened around the same time, a little bit before I started writing the column too. And look, that was right at the nascency of that explosion in spirits production. And so as a writer, you're just looking for the most interesting, the most dynamic stories that are available, particularly stories that people want to read. And I was definitely aware that people were interested in what was being produced locally. So that's what I started writing about. And some of the comments early doors were hilarious. People would just laugh. The comments sections, I think the second, third article I wrote was about Australian spirits. There's something like 250 comments on that article within the space of, I think, about 4 hours of it being published. And most of it was pretty encouraging, but some of it was just like, you can't make whiskey in Australia. This is a joke. What are you thinking about? And so only some of the older readers actually remembered that we have distilling heritage, particularly in whiskey here. Occasionally they'd chime in, but other than that, the Australian whiskey side of things was really unexplored from a publication point of view. And I was coming, I think, from the same point as James Smith with Crafty Pint was coming from. He was a little bit frustrated that no one was really writing about craft beer in any sort of dedicated or professional way back then. And he used to write for the majors as well, for Fairfax, and then switched over to creating Crafty Pint. And I suppose in a lot of ways I've sort of followed that same trajectory. So,
yeah. It is fascinating people in your career trajectory who you have often had a mirrored career with in some ways. For me, that's someone like Scott Fitzsimons. So that's just my own little shout out to him. But I was just going to say, in your experience as both behind the bar and writing about the development of Australian spirits, what are some of the trends that you could remark on over the last sort of 5 to 10 years that you've seen really change in the way that maybe the way it's ordered or the way it's sort of marketed or the way it's talked about?
I think it's Australian consumers becoming comfortable with talking about Australian brands. From a bar perspective, I think hopefully that's what I try and bring to a lot of the writing that I do. I do spend a lot of time still working behind bars, and those interactions are so different to what you read online. Everything about whiskey in the actual hospitality space, I find, is just completely different to what you see written about online and what you see people drinking as well. So, Whiskey and Elm and other whiskey bars in Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, right across the country, Brisbane, Perth, you name it. You'll have dedicated people who know their brands and are interested in trying certain Australian whiskies, but the general public has no idea. They really don't. You rarely see them. Your general whiskey drinker is not going to come and ask for an Australian whiskey and Coke. Ned Whiskey is trying to get people there and bring people along that journey. But one of the trends that I've seen is that I still think there's a massive gulf between Australian whiskey and Australian spirits capturing the general audience and making them aware of the fact that Australian spirits exist and we make some really amazing stuff. The brands that I'd say that have sort of changed that conversation are things like Four Pillars. Like, I know, we're in a whiskey chat here, but the brand strength and the work that Four Pillars have done, when I'm working behind places now, when you have general people who you can tell aren't that experienced in booze, name calling and brand calling Four Pillars, that's pretty incredible. And that shows you how things have changed. When I started writing about Four Pillars ago, sort of 6 years ago, to think that the general public would, in such a short period of time, be interested in that brand and be aware of the fact they make different styles of gin and all that sort of stuff. And I can see that coming for Australian whiskey too. I think we're a few years away, but we're pretty close. And that to me has been one of the biggest trends, just simply putting Australian whiskey in front of people and making people aware of the fact that we actually make this stuff here and the stuff that we make is pretty brilliant.
Speaking of which, you sort of triggered a word that was going to be part of a discussion, and I want to bring this into this chat we're having. I'm one of those people that thinks there's sort of 4 distinct eras of Australian whiskey in many ways. Mm-hmm. I think you've got 1822 which lasted a good sort of 120-ish years. You've got the second era with Lynn and Bill in 1992. You've got the third era, which I'm going to call 2014 to 2019. And you've got the fourth era, which is sort of the now and some of the changes we've seen. But I want to start from sort of the present. This fourth era that I think we're seeing in Australian spirit is I think a lot to do with the scale, and B, embracing other spirits. So now that we're seeing a bit of a resurgence, we're seeing a bit of different spirit types. We're seeing players like Ned come on the scene and try and evolve past just Tasmanian single casks. And what are your thoughts on that? Do you think I'm fairly on the mark there with that sort of era sort of categorization a little bit?
I think, yeah, you're pretty close. I'd probably divide the history up slightly differently, the past history. I think other people have done similarly. Sort of me and Chris Middleton, who's one of the founders of Starwood, probably knows more about the history of Australian whiskey, I think, than anyone in the world. He would probably break it up into that early period of New South Wales, Tasmania, then the colonial period that you saw develop in Victoria, where you had very large distilleries producing huge amounts of whiskey and doing it very well. And by the end of that phase, even exporting. And then I think Corio ushered in a new period altogether, which sort of ultimately ended in the death of those colonial malt distilleries for a variety of reasons. And then, like you said, I could sort of see Lynn and Bill and Tasmanian whiskey, and I think it includes people like Smith in that conversation as well. Smith's Anguson were right there producing whiskey at exactly the same time. It's just that people don't really talk about it. And then you had other spirits producers like Spike Desert up in the Kimberley making rum at the same time, and he even did whiskey in the late 90s too. So there were lots of other people in and around involved in that period, and I can definitely see, as you mentioned, that there's a new era coming. Obviously Arch Heroes are ushering that in, as places like the Whitten Malthouse, which I just wrote about recently, larger distilleries opening up in Tasmania now too, and particularly different styles of whiskey becoming really well produced and really well received by a broader community in stuff like the gospel, backwoods, whippersnappers whiskies are always getting better. I think are right up there at the moment too. So yeah, we are seeing this evolution, and there are different phases. Often that has to do with capacity. It has to do with brand presence and awareness as well, I think. How things develop here, like it's all evolving. But COVID is such a shame last year as well, because I think the Australian industry had probably one of its most fascinating and strongest years last year than really it has over the last 10. There's a lot of change, a lot of new entrants, a lot of really amazing whiskey release, I think of a pretty high quality too. So yeah, where we move from here is anyone's guess.
Well, quality is a point I want to get onto in just a moment. But I'm just going to let's take a comment here from Alex, who says he's a paid-up subscriber and loves the writing, Luke. And James Finnegan that says, who's asking a question, where do you see the opportunities are for the industry to educate the Aussie public on our spirits?
Yeah, lots of different ways to do that. Definitely the distillery door. That's the thing that I always used to encourage people both writing for Fairfax and just generally talking to them behind the bar. That's the beauty that we have here. It's probably one of the real distinct advantages. And it is something genuinely distinct that we have in Australia from some other distilleries in the world, like particularly a lot of Scottish distilleries, Japanese distilleries too. If you go into Australian whiskey distilleries and Australian spirits producers today, you're more than likely going to meet the person who created and founded the brand at the cellar door. So that is a pretty incredible experience. That's something that's not going to be around forever as well. But at the moment, yeah, that's the opportunity you have. That's, to me, is the best way to find out and discover more about those distilleries. Not everyone can make it to these distilleries. As someone who's visited a lot of them, you just forget how big Australia is. And the fact that they're dotted all across the country just makes it that little bit harder. Bars, I think, can continue to do more work in the space as well. I think we're seeing a lot of great bars take on Australian spirits, take on Australian whiskies, and do a good job of it. The education side of it is going to continue to improve. At Whisky and Almond, we loved that side of it. It was really fun, and we worked super hard on developing that, doing classes. I used to do classes every Saturday, basically, for a number of years there, where we do Australian, Japanese whiskey. We talk through introductions to whiskey, different styles, you name it. So that side of it, I think, has improved greatly. I think we ended up, there must have been like 20,000 people, 15 to 20,000 people through those classes. Now, distilleries, through their social media channels, through their branding and marketing, through the events that they put on. I mean, I don't need to tell you about events. The SMWS does a whole stack of them. And the education that comes from that is super beneficial. And the more Australian distilleries that can get out there and tell those stories and run those events too, the better for the industry. But, they're resource-intensive events, just events and branding generally are resources that a lot of Australian distilleries sort of quite aren't at the level of at the moment, but give it another 5-10 years and that'll change as well. So education will continue to improve, I think, no doubt.
Fantastic. Now, just want to touch on the point of quality and where we've been, where we're going, and some of the challenges that you see in the local industry. I think one of the criticisms you often see from from the whiskey community is that the quality of a lot of Australian whiskey is sometimes can sometimes be suffering from sort of some mistakes that we're still learning from in the past. I would label some of those things as, you know, the problem of overly tannic whiskies or small casks. So what's some of the problems that you would encourage here? Like, sorry, not some of the problems that you would identify that perhaps moving forward could improve quality of local product as well. Not that
Yeah, look, I suppose through the website and through other things, and particularly through the website, I suppose we try to, we have our opinions. Everyone who writes for the site has their opinions on what they like and what they enjoy. I'm always careful to directly say to distillers or producers, you know, we think you should be doing it this way. And, you know, we do offer advice and we're happy to where we think it. But, you know, ultimately, I'm not a distiller. I'm not a producer. And people are going to make decisions about how they want to make their whiskey. We can taste it, enjoy it, and then, you know, tell them what we think. That's basically how I see my role there. In a spirits judging contest, it gets a little bit more intense because, you know, I've been judging in a number of competitions now. I think from that point of view, yeah, things like you mentioned, overly tannic whiskies, wood-driven whiskies generally. I don't have a problem with wood-driven whiskies, and I think the criticism that's often levelled at Australian whiskey is that it's too wood-driven, and I can certainly sympathise with that and understand that. I think it's only really an issue because you get a lot of wood-driven whiskies, and you just don't get a lot on the other spectrum. I think that's, and you know, Scottish whiskey by and large is the opposite way, as is Japanese whiskey, as are a lot of European whiskies that are produced now. You know, they're spirit-driven, they're spirit-led, and so Australian whiskey looks very different in that context. If we had, say, 30, 40, 50% of Australian whiskey matured and you know, designed with that fashion and with that idea in mind, I think people would be less critical of some very wood-heavy Australian whiskies. It's just that there's not a lot of balance at the moment. But again, I think that's going to change, and you're already seeing it. What I saw last year was more whiskey matured in ex-bourbon casks, more whiskey released in larger format casks too. Yes, there's been criticism of producers using small format casks and you know, producing very woody, you know, somewhat overly tannic whiskies as a result. The other thing that I've observed in spirits judging is that it improves year on year. Jules and I and Ev do spirits judging. A bunch of other people around the country also join us in that judging. I got to judge with Pat Maguire from Sullivan's Cove this year as well, which is a great experience. And tell you what, we always observe is the quality increases year on year. So as long as people are giving, you know, honest feedback, which I hope comes from, I suppose, a space or a place of experience to distillers and to, you know, blenders now. We're getting people blending whiskey here too, and they take that on board. You know, we're seeing the quality of whiskey rise and change and develop, and that's just, for me, it's just natural. That's a natural progression. People tend to find that people get very heated when they talk about Australian whiskey. I think I'm always trying to turn the heat down a bit and just keep it a bit more fun and relaxed. It always surprises me how seriously people take Australian whiskey. So yeah, that's always an interesting one for me. You know, we're still a super young industry, even though we have all of this heritage behind us. Most of the distilleries are still sort of finding their feet. Some are very close to being, you know, up there with some of the leading producers in the world. But look, it just takes time, and whiskey especially takes time, and people just need to relax a little bit, I think.
Yeah, awesome. The website that you're referencing, well, some feedback coming through again there. The website that you're referencing is, of course, your website, Oz Whisky Review, which I'll just throw up on screen here for everyone to see. That is, you do a mixture of subscriber-only articles and also some open public ones as well, if I recall. But I've been a subscriber since I first heard about it, and I really appreciate it, and I strongly encourage anyone who's interested in even any discussion on Australian whiskey to check out Oz Whisky Review, which is Luke's endeavour. Tell us more about how this site came about. What was the inspiration behind building something like this?
I think there were a lot of different inspirations, a lot of different ideas I was throwing around at the time. In a weird way, I think it sort of came about from ScotchWhiskey.com's closure. That shocked me no end. I used that when I was back behind the bar and constantly researching very, you know, sort of intricate details around whiskey production, and even then, you know, more broad discussions about the industry generally. That was just the ultimate resource for me. It was an incredible resource. Me coming from somewhere, a place of books, you know, books are also one of my real passion. And my early learning in whiskey was all done through books and through visiting distilleries and chatting to people. And then, you had blogs like Nonjata for Japanese whiskey, which came along. Nonjata was an incredible resource for us at the bar for a long time there. That was just brilliant information, given to the world freely by people who really knew what they were talking about. ScotchWhisky.com was also, the same, but slightly more resource intensive and so much energy and time and brilliance had been put into that site. And when I saw it close, and when I saw what I was getting paid to write various publications around the world, and probably most importantly, I wasn't able to get the sort of writing around Australian whiskey, around whiskey generally, published really anywhere in Australia. And I suppose privately, I've been pretty critical of Australian media over the last sort of 5-6 years. I don't think a lot of media companies have done a brilliant job at really sort of giving people an opportunity to explore Australian subjects in in-depth ways. But, still keep it fun and entertaining as well. I realise that that's a really important part of any media organisation, any media product. And so that was really the inspiration behind Oz Whisky Review. It was to create a space where we could talk about Australian whiskey in an in-depth, informative, and hopefully, still a fun and entertaining way, but cover all of the amazing stuff that was happening in the industry, because it wasn't being covered really anywhere by an Australian publication, by an international publication. The lack of knowledge on Australian whiskey, when I started, and I still feel now, is pretty basic. And so there were the sort of things that I was trying to develop. And then it's about trying to create a business that is sustainable. So, I can make a little bit of a living off it as well, and that we can pay writers to also contribute and get something out of that experience as well. I was really conscious of the fact that, ScotchWhisky.com, one of the most read websites in whiskey on the world, and still couldn't find a way to be financially viable. And that was really frightening for me. And so that was definitely behind the decision to take it to a subscriber platform and then see how we go from there.
Well, I wish you all the best, and I'm very proud of you. I'll just grab some questions and comments coming in as we head up to the half-hour mark here. There's they didn't put their name in, but it says, Luke, you offer a great balance of constructive advice and encouraging positive feedback. We always enjoy the chats we have with you about whiskey. So thank you to a Facebook user. I can't see their name. They haven't allowed StreamYard onto their platform.
Sounds like a distiller, doesn't it? Maybe.
That's okay.
I'm not sure.
It very well could be. And then Sam Licardi, a favorite of the stream, says, Macca is an all-round great human, a wealth of knowledge, and such a great advocate for Aussie spirits. Great cricketer too.
Well, I don't know about that. Some days I'm okay. Other days I'm absolutely woeful. But a big shout out to Sam. He's an absolute legend down here in Melbourne as well. And Sam's, I think, the new brigade. He's a part of the younger people that are coming through. Both in Melbourne and Sydney. There are so many other people. Like the amount of young distillers coming through now. That again, I don't think a lot of people are really aware of. But so many amazing distilleries around the country have a lot of young talent coming through. Just a lot of fantastic younger people entering the industry now as well. So it's going to look completely different in another 15, 20 years, that's for sure.
Yeah, it does actually make us look like the old farts. I know. You know what, actually, I had Sam on the live stream, I think about a year ago, Sam, I would say. It would be maybe 10 months ago. And I think I introduced him as the youngest working brand ambassador of spirits in Australia at the time. So, boy genius right there. Question from Jason Robson asks, where can we find a copy of the Australian Spirit Guide these days? Again, just to put some context as to what he's talking about, this fantastic book that Luke released in 2016, which featured over 51 standout distilleries. Luke, where can we find that book today? It's one of your publications.
Yeah, it's a good question. I have no idea. I would actually throw it out there to everyone. If you do find a copy, I'm probably going to get it, because I have people asking me for copies. And, when you write a book, you want people to buy it. And so you don't really necessarily think about stockpiling huge amounts of copies, forever. You want people to get it and read it. So I actually don't know. The best place would be in online retailers like AbeBooks, maybe Amazon. There'd be some secondhand bookstores, I think, that would possibly have it as well. But we did the initial print run, and that eventually sold through, and then we haven't printed any more. So I think it's I was aware that it was going to become dated quite quickly as well. So I wanted to create a book that sort of gave people an overview of where the industry had come from and where it was potentially going. And so, yeah, as a book in that regard, I'm pretty happy with it. But, you know, I quickly realized as the industry grew very, very rapidly that, you know, the book was fast becoming out of date. And so, again, that was, I suppose, another impetus to develop the website. It was to update a lot of those details. And, you know, my learnings on Australian spirits history and whiskey history as well have evolved dramatically since that book. And there are elements of the history in that book which I would completely rewrite, to be honest. I think I've learned, there was just really no information on this stuff when I sat down to write that book 5 years ago. And everything's changed pretty rapidly since. So, maybe...
That sort of the thing. As soon as you write a book about distilleries, by the time it's published, it's somewhat out of date. But that's the curse of writing about current distilleries, because even ones that are still there, maybe their capacity's changed, or hence why something like the Malt Whisky Yearbook is such a great resource as well, because it's updated each year and things like that. But no, I see where you're going, and that's why your site, Oz Whisky Review, will cover, I guess, a lot of those updates over time as well. By the way, that last comment before about great balance of constructive advice and encouraging positive feedback was from Bree. Bree from...
cool. All right.
There you go, Bree. And Steve Oates says, regarding interviews, has there been a favourite or most memorable, and who would you love to have a chat with regarding spirits?
Favourite or most memorable? Jeez, there's been stacks. I think one of my most memorable was probably two that would really stick out. And I've had lots of crazy interviews too. Interviews with distillers in bars and pubs, bartenders, you name it, that were raucous and mad. Mostly stories that I prefer to keep off the internet. But what really sticks in my mind is being taken around a Miyagi-Ko distillery by a gentleman who had worked at that stage for Nikka for over 40 years. I had a translator with me, and the experience of going around Miyagi-Ko that day was truly incredible. I think he gave me something like 3 or 4 hours of his time. It was only meant to go for an hour and a half, but I kept asking these questions, really in-depth questions about Taketsuru, his development of Miyagi-Ko and Yoichi, and basically from there he just kept opening doors, kept opening whiskies. I got to see the coffee stills at Miyagi-Ko as well. He took me through the whole production cycle of that. And then at the end, he poured whiskey for me and just sort of sat there, just sort of humbly just looking at me, looking for like nods of approval or I don't know what. I think he poured me like 10 Nikka whiskies at the end of it. And the experience there was absolutely incredible. That's something I'll never forget. And it brought me closer to the whole Nikka whiskey story, and I think the Japanese whiskey story generally. And he had actually, been around during the times at the end of the lives of some of those really pivotal people in the industry there. So that was something I'll always hang on to. It was incredible, amazing experience. Person I'd like to talk about spirits too, I think they're mainly dead. There's none that are alive, I think. So Taketsuru would be one of the guys. I would love to talk to Taketsuru. That would be, for me, absolutely incredible. I think the guy, the life that he lived was just absolutely remarkable. The other people I'd love to talk to would be, again, they're all gone. There was a chemist that worked for Federal Distilleries back for about 3 decades, actually. His last name was Brelaz, NJM Brelaz, I'm pretty sure. He was French and then came to Australia. He started working for Federal Distilleries in the early 1900s. And he actually has this amazing origin story of going to Scotland in the 1920s and pouring all of these Australian Melbourne-made whiskies, the Scottish distilleries, receiving their feedback. They were generally staggered by the quality of the whiskey being made by Federal at that point. And he worked there for decades. And so when I sort of referred to before about sort of, I suppose, the disconnect between that older period of Australian whiskey heritage and the current period, there was at that stage 70 years of Australian whiskey production and history for those distillers and blenders to draw on. Unfortunately, with Karaya, with the eventual sort of winding up of these large distilleries in the 70s and 80s, none of that knowledge really was passed on to the next generation of distilleries. And this is like important stuff around terms of maturation, size of casks, wine casks as well. Australian wine casks were being used at that point in time. So even distillation, fermentation in Australian conditions too. So none of that stuff really survived. Some records have survived, which we sort of wrote about last year. But they'd be the people that I'd be the most interested and fascinated in talking to, I think.
Wow. Yeah. I think it's much the same. Well, for some of the guests I've had on live with SMWS, I was asked that very same question about if I could interview anyone, who would it be? And I said, well, actually, unfortunately, he's passed away, but I would have loved to have someone like Dr. Jim Swan on here. And I think that would have been a really interesting discussion. But of course, that didn't actually happen. There's some great questions and comments still coming through. James Caden asks, going forward, what would you like Australian whiskey to be known for globally? Pardon me. Also, is there a particular competitive advantage we have over here that maybe the industry is not yet fully exploiting?
Yeah, that's an issue. I think, look, there's probably about a dozen, maybe a couple dozen people in the industry right now that are trying to develop that edge. They're trying to figure out what that edge is and whether or not it's, I suppose, attractive enough to international consumers of whiskey. And if so, how do we then get Australian whiskey into the hands of those people? So we definitely have I mean, look at Australian wine. Look at Australian beer is a slightly different story because beer doesn't travel as well. But if we look at Australian wine, even the history of Australian spirits production prior to sort of the current era, people, particularly throughout Asia, Americans as well, love Australian produce. There's absolutely no doubt about that. In the last 12 months, Australia has developed a pretty strong brand story around how well we produce things here, how well we can take care of our own. Look, I think we've still got a lot of issues here as a country, as a nation, but there's no doubt that people love what we make. And so if we can continue to do that, continue to its scale, and develop sophistication around telling a particularly Australian story with the whiskey that we make, then absolutely, I think there's an enormous opportunity internationally. And the people that are, I suppose, leading that conversation and are leading that movement are people like David Vitale with Starwood. I think David is probably, it's a little bit underrated what David has done for the industry and how important he's been in sort of just even conceptualizing what Australian whiskey might look like internationally and overseas. That's, that is a challenge in itself, just developing the blueprint. What do we want to take to the world? How do we want our whiskey to taste? What do we want to represent as a style of whiskey? And as a distillery and as a brand. And so, David, I think, and Starwood are really well advanced in that particular space at the moment. And then wine casks are obviously a big part of their story. Whether or not wine casks become a story for the majority of Australian whiskies that make it overseas, I'm fascinated to see. I think I'm most fascinated, probably more from a philosophical point of view, with Australian native grains and Australian native timbers, whether or not they can be used to good effect to create high quality whiskey that actually tastes good, that people want to drink. I think that's going to be the real challenge, because some of the flavors you get there, particularly with native timbers, are pretty wacky. But there is opportunity there to tell an incredible Australian story through the whiskey that we produce here. So yeah,
it's funny you mentioned that. It's especially mentioning Dave Vitale, who has often talked about the why, as he calls it, the reason for creating, not just he's not overly. I remember him not being overly fond of sort of talking about sort of transparency or authenticity are both two marketing buzzwords that have been used to death. But the why, the why something should exist or should be using these ingredients or these materials is quite important. Which is why every Starwood that is released has had some contact with the wine cask along the way, just about, with the exception of with very rare exception. And so it's and also that sense of place and land of where it's made. I was actually at a distillery recently that I'm not allowed. I don't know if I'm allowed to say which one, but I was at a distillery recently who had a whole rack of red gum casks.
Yep.
That were mature.
I might know which distillery you're talking about.
You might know which distillery you're talking about. And there's a rack of about 12 or maybe more. I couldn't see all the way in. Red gum casks, and I think they're fairly smallish, about 100-liter casks maybe, which was very cool. And it's sort of that sense of, well, why don't we use those kind of materials to make Australian whiskey? And of course, that point of Australian whiskey shouldn't try to be Scotch whiskey or shouldn't try to be Irish whiskey. And I think that's one of the mistakes that a lot of Australian whiskey critics make, in that we don't expect Indian whiskey to taste like Scotch whiskey. We don't expect Japanese whiskey to taste like Scotch whiskey, even though they share a bit more lineage, I would say, than others. But it's so why do we? There shouldn't be an expectation that Australian whiskey should try to reach a level of Scotch whiskey, but it should have its own sense of place and purpose.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. I totally wholeheartedly agree with that. And I think, that was something the Australian wine industry did very successfully too. They realized that decades ago and said, we're not going to be able to make Burgundy in Australia. I mean, we can try and we can do a pretty good job of it. And sometimes we'll even fool, the best tasters in the world. But we need to make wines that say something about who we are and where we're from. And I think the Australian whiskies that are going to be most successful overseas are, the products that do exactly that have a unique selling point to them, that people want to engage with and try, even for the first time, and then hopefully, over and over again. I think that's the big battle. That's where the real challenge lies. But once you've got people to try it for, however unique it is or whatever unique selling point it has, and then getting them to like it, and that comes down to price and value, and taste and flavor as well. So, and ultimately the story, how you connect with the story of what that product represents.
So one of those challenges then is essentially consistency.
Yes, definitely. And I think that's a question that the international whiskey industry, more broadly, I think has been debating now for probably 15, 20 years. Scotch is probably in a different category there because, consistency is fundamental to Scotch whiskey. And if you think that blended whiskey is fundamental to what Scotch whiskey is, to how it's consumed, to how the whole business model operates, then consistency has always been front of center for Scottish whiskey, and that's one of the reasons why Scotch is so bloody successful. I mean, I know we have the SMWS, amazing independent bottlers, single cask coming from all over the place, and more experimentation coming through everywhere. But the reason all of that stuff is allowed to exist and can exist is because people love blended Scotch, and blended Scotch is in bars everywhere. It's being mixed all the time. It's being cracked everywhere. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm fully aware that as a whiskey club that bottles predominantly single cask whiskey, we owe a huge debt of gratitude to blended whiskey for us even being able to do what we do, because it's that interest in the category that creates these the more niche interests, I guess.
Yep, definitely. And often it's just about getting that first product through the door to get people interested. And I don't think that first product, and it might be, who knows? I could be wrong here, but I don't think that first product is going to be a $250 single malt going into the UK or the European market or the United States market. I think it's going to be something that's much more affordable, something like a Starwood, something like a Ned Whiskey, or something similar. I still think there's huge opportunity for a business or a thinker or a creator to come along and say, yeah, let's create a whiskey that tastes good, is well made, well constructed, but something that we can take to the world as well. And if you look at all of the other major whiskey industries, I think that's the point I think I've harped on to with distillers, Australian distillers and particularly all over the world. The Japanese whiskey industry started with blends. It started with mass market product. Scotch whiskey, that's what got Scotch whiskey going. Irish whiskey was the same. They had a high quality of whiskey at the time, but again, it was stuff that was saleable, it was consistent, and bourbon is exactly that as well. It's much more affordable, and it's good value for money product as well. So whether or not Australian whiskey can operate under a different trajectory or on a different trajectory, I'm not sure. It'll be fascinating to see. But I think if we want more people, both in Australia and internationally, drinking Australian whiskey, then it's going to take brands of that nature to rise. And whether or not that happens, we'll see.
Do you think that there's room? Do you think we've reached maximum capacity of the number of distilleries? Perhaps are we getting closer to that sort of point, or do you think there's still a lot of room for that industry, for the industry to grow here in that capacity?
It's interesting. I think people said that about Australian gin. Probably when I published the book, people were saying there's too many Australian gin distilleries, and I think probably since that point it's doubled again. So it's hard to say. I think. Is there a floor? Is there a maximum number? I'm not entirely sure. I think craft beer has sort of leveled out a little bit. I genuinely think that what we see in Australian spirits production pretty much mirrors what has happened in Australian craft beer. And new breweries are continuing to open now, but definitely a lot of Australian craft breweries have also fallen by the wayside. They've been gobbled up by other companies. They've been amalgamated. So yeah, whether or not we see that in the future or whether or not more Australian distilleries continue to come online. I think I actually heard some stats around this recently that one of the peak years for new distilling licenses, specifically for whiskey, was about 2017-18, and there's been a bit of a drop-off since. So maybe you'd expect that there mightn't be as many new distilleries opening in the next sort of 5 or 10 years. But every time I thought we couldn't do with more, or surely maybe we won't get any more distilleries opening up, there's more have continued to come and more have continued to open. So who knows, mate? I'm not really sure. What do you think on
that? I think we've got a couple more years of, I think, still solidly more distilleries opening. I think we're going to see that. But I think your point about it mirroring craft beer is quite an apt one. There was a comment that came through earlier, which I just want to grab. See if I can grab that one. Great question from Alex Uziello here, who says, Luke or Matt, open question. Do you see the large multinational players looking to buy into or setting up in the Australian market? Is that a natural progression as the market evolves in this current phase? So, I mean, your point before about these craft distilleries, when you can name a dozen of them off the top of my head, of just where they're now owned by CUB or InBev or Asahi, and that was a progression of that industry for the market of that industry. Do you see that happening here? Is that essentially Alex's question here?
I suppose it ultimately comes down to whether or not those companies are interested, and I think they need to see a brand. Those companies want to see a brand that they can leverage and attach themselves to, and and something that they can grow. So, those companies are going to want that distillery to be able to show them certain elements of their process, certain elements of their sort of brand thinking that can scale. And whether or not there's a number of distilleries in the country at the moment that sort of have all those things in place just yet, I think there will be a number of distilleries that will eventually get there. I also think that there's probably a lot of distilleries, Australian whiskey producers, that aren't really set up for that. I don't think that's really what their end game is. Some of them, I think they definitely have that in the back of their mind. And I've got no doubt in the next 10 years, you'll probably see, like you saw in craft beer, like we've seen, with some Australian gin brands as well, they'll be, they'll get a little bit of injection from funds from larger multinational companies, and then who knows how things will grow there. The difference with whiskey is that it's just such a different game in terms of maturation and time. And a lot of these Australian distilleries, Australian whiskey producers, are still fairly young, and they're still sort of trying to figure out exactly, what's the ultimate age of my whiskey going to be? I mean, are we constantly going to release 2 or 3 year old whiskey and we're happy with that? Or as a company coming in and wanting to invest in Australian whiskey in a distillery or a brand, I think you probably want a few more of those unknowns answered before you jumped on board. But look, I've heard rumours and murmurings, and I know companies are interested. I definitely know they're interested. Whether or not they take the leap, and whether or not Australian distilleries, Australian whiskey producers are happy to deal with the consequences of having a large multinational in your business. That's another question entirely again.
Yeah. This has been an absolutely enlightening chat. So thank you so much for your time this evening with Live with SMWS. Always a pleasure to catch up with you, and just having someone like yourself who's such a font of knowledge of the Australian whiskey and indeed spirit scene is an absolute asset. So thank you so much for taking the time out to catch up with us this evening. I really appreciate it. And I know all of our members appreciate it too, because the amount of comments and questions coming through on the stream that we didn't even get a chance to put up on the stream here has been overwhelming. So really appreciate it. And I really appreciate everyone tuning in and watching tonight. So Luke, if we can just throw a comment in the section for Luke, because this has been so fantastic. So thanks again.
Pleasure, mate. Thank you everyone for listening. And hey, thanks for everyone for contributing and showing some interest in the Aussie scene. It's been amazing. So I really appreciate it, and thanks. Hopefully, talk to you soon. And
before we jump out, I'm just going to again show once more that we've got here's what the homepage currently looks like of Oz Whisky Review. Screenshot taken today. So that's the current layout of the of what's going on over there. It's not just reviews, of course. It's some great in-depth stuff. I do encourage you to check it out. And also this is the second of the second of 3 live streams this week. Make sure I encourage you to tune in again on Thursday night, where we'll be catching up live with Heather Tellett, the head distiller from Sullivan's Cove, who'll be joining us live on the stream. Until then, thank you everyone for tuning in. Thanks again, Luke, for being a part of it, and we'll catch up with you all soon.
Thanks, mate. Cheers.